Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Find a comfortable place now, a favorite chair, perhaps, or tucked into your bed. Let your head rest upon your pillow. Dim the lights. Let the day and all its worries begin to dissolve like sugar in warm water. We are here together in this quiet space to let a story unfold. A long, slow story designed to carry you gently from the noise of the waking world into the peaceful country of sleep. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to remember. Just allow my voice to be a soft current in the darkness and let yourself drift. Tonight, our journey takes us to a place born of water and dreams, a city that holds its secrets close, like pearls in the silt of a riverbed. We are going to Nouvelle Orleans, New Orleans, a city where the air itself feels heavy with history, where ghosts are not just stories but neighbors. We are going back, far back, to the very beginning, to a time when the city was just a muddy outpost, a desperate gamble clinging to a crescent of land, and we are going to talk about the women who were sent to tame it. They have a name that whispers of both the treasure and the grave. They are known to history as Les Filles à la Cassette, the Casket Girls. Their tale has two currents, like the great river that defines their city. One is a current of history, a story of hardship and incredible resilience, documented in ship manifests and the letters of nuns. The other is a darker current, a current of folklore that flows through the gaslit imagination of the French Quarter, a story of vampires and a secret locked away in a dusty attic for 300 years. Tonight we will drift along both currents. We will see how history can curdle into legend and how a legend can tell a truth all its own. So close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and another. Let the sounds of the Louisiana night settle around you. The crickets are singing their ancient song. The air is warm and thick as velvet, and a story is waiting to be told. And as you settle in, if you find comfort in our time together, I would be so grateful if you'd leave a comment below when you wake. It brings me such joy to know that these stories are a welcome part of your nightly ritual, and I especially love to read where in the world you are listening from. It makes our quiet little community feel connected, all of us listening together under the same moon. For now, though, just rest. Let's begin. Listen to the quiet. Before we can understand the story of the girls, we must first understand the world that made them, a world they would leave behind forever. Let us drift back across the ocean, back in time, to the heart of a great and troubled kingdom. We are in Paris. But this is not the Paris of postcards and love songs. This is the Paris of the early 18th century. Imagine, if you will, the sounds of that city. The distant rhythmic clank of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of iron-rimmed cartwheels on uneven cobblestones, a sound like rolling thunder that never quite breaks, the murmur of 1,000 conversations, a river of French voices flowing through narrow, winding streets. A church bell tolls the hour, its heavy bronze voice echoing over a sea of slate rooftops. Now imagine the smells. The air is a thick soup. There is the sharp, acrid scent of coal smoke from a million chimneys, a constant gray haze that stings the eyes and coats the tongue. There is the rich, earthy smell of horse manure, a byproduct of the city's primary engine. From the tanneries along the river, a sharp chemical tang of curing hides rises on the breeze, and underneath it all, the ever-present cloying smell of humanity packed too tightly together, of unwashed bodies and water drawn from a polluted Seine. This is a city of staggering contrasts. In the gilded halls of Versailles, a universe away in spirit, King Louis XV holds court. His world is a fantasy of silk, of brocade, of powdered wigs, piled high like sponge sugar. It is a world of intricate dances, whispered intrigues, and a level of opulence that beggars belief. The wealth of the nation flows to this single point, a glittering vortex of consumption. But for every courtier in a velvet coat, there are 1,000 souls in rags. For every gilded palace, there are 1,000 hovels, their damp timbers leaning on one another for support as if exhausted by the weight of their own misery. In these dark, crowded tenements and in the streets below lives a different Paris, a Paris of hunger, of desperation, of forgotten people. And in this world, to be born a girl into a poor family was to be born into a precarious existence. A daughter was another mouth to feed, another soul to shelter, but most critically, she was a dowry to be found. In the rigid social structure of the time, a respectable marriage was a woman's only path to security, and a respectable marriage was impossible without a dowry. It was a business transaction, a merging of family assets. A girl with no assets, no property, no money to bring to a union was a girl with no future. What options were left for her? The streets and a life of brutal brevity, or for many the cold, embracing arms of the church. The city was dotted with institutions that were part hospital, part orphanage, part workhouse, and part prison. They were catch-alls for the city's unwanted. And one of the largest, the most infamous, was the Hôpital de la Salpêtrière. Let the sounds of the bustling city fall away now, replaced by the hollow echo of footsteps on stone. We are inside its walls. The air is cold, even in summer, chilled by the massive stone blocks that form its structure. There is a faint, rhythmic, industrial sound in the background, the clack, clack, clack of looms, the whir of spinning wheels, a constant reminder that this is a place of labor. La Salpêtrière, the name itself means saltpeter, for the gunpowder factory that once stood upon its grounds. It is a fitting name, for it was a place of contained, explosive, human misery. A sprawling complex on the banks of the Seine, it was a city of sorrow unto itself, built to sweep the poor, the mad, the deviant, and the orphaned from the streets of Paris and hide them from public view. It housed thousands of souls, and among them, in their own segregated wing, were hundreds upon hundreds of young girls. Orphans, foundlings, girls whose parents were too poor to keep them. Imagine their life. It is a life painted in shades of gray. They rise before the sun, their first breaths of the day misting in the frigid air of the vast, unheated dormitories. They kneel for prayers, their knees aching from the cold flagstones. Their days are spent not in classrooms learning literature or music, but in workrooms, their small, nimble fingers becoming extensions of the machines they tend. They spin thread, they weave cloth, they sew fine linens for the wealthy households of Paris, for ladies who will sleep on their handiwork without a single thought for the small hands that made it. Their food is gray, a thin, watery gruel, perhaps a crust of hard bread. Their clothes are gray, a simple, rough-spun habit that scratches the skin. Their world is bounded by gray stone walls, under a perpetually gray Parisian sky. They are taught three virtues above all others: piety, obedience, and industry. They learn to keep their heads bowed, their voices low, and their hopes small. A hope for an extra piece of bread. A hope for a moment of sunshine in the courtyard. A hope to avoid the wrath of a stern-faced nun. But even in a place as grim as La Salpêtrière, dreams can take root. Like a stubborn flower pushing its way through a crack in the stone, dreams of a world beyond the walls. A world of color, of warmth, a dream of a husband, not as a romantic fantasy, but as a symbol of a life of one's own. A dream of a home, no matter how humble, that was not a dormitory filled with the coughing and quiet weeping of 100 other girls. These were dangerous, precious dreams, whispered from cot to cot in the deep of the night. And then one day, into this gray, ordered, hopeless world, a new whisper arrived. A rumor that spread through the workrooms and dormitories like a fever. A whisper about a place so far away it might as well have been the moon. A place with a musical, magical-sounding name, Louisiana. The word itself was a song. They would have heard the stories that were circulating all over France, stories actively promoted by the Mississippi Company, a venture spearheaded by a brilliant and reckless financier named John Law. His company had been granted a royal charter to develop France's vast, untamed territory in North America. To attract investors and colonists, they printed pamphlets and posters that depicted Louisiana not as it was, but as a fever dream of paradise. These pamphlets showed a land bathed in golden light, a Garden of Eden on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. The pictures showed French gentlemen in powdered wigs casually pointing to mountains of gold and silver, while elegantly dressed ladies strolled through orchards heavy with exotic fruits. Native peoples were depicted as gentle, welcoming souls, eager to trade precious gems for simple trinkets. It was a lie, a magnificent, shimmering, and ultimately catastrophic lie. John Law's scheme would become known as the Mississippi Bubble, and when it burst, it would bankrupt thousands of investors and shake the French economy to its foundations. But for a time, the dream of Louisiana was potent, and the real colony, the one of mud and mosquitoes, had a serious, fundamental problem that no pamphlet could solve. It was a colony of men, soldiers sent from France to man the primitive forts, dying more from disease than from any enemy. Convicts, emptied from the prisons of Paris and other cities, sent to provide forced labor under the brutal sun. Adventurers, debtors, and fortune seekers, men on the run from their past, hoping for a quick score in a new land. And the coureurs des bois, the runners of the woods, tough, independent fur trappers who knew the swamps and bayous intimately but had no interest in building towns or settling down. The colony was a barracks, a penal colony, a trading post. It was violent, rough, and profoundly unstable. It was not a society. It was not a home. For a society to grow, to put down roots and flourish, it needs families. And for families, it needs women. Jean-Baptiste Lemoine, Sieur de Bienville, the determined, long-suffering father of New Orleans, understood this better than anyone. He had spent years trying to shape this unruly territory. He sent dispatch after dispatch back to the French crown, to the directors of the Company of the Indies which had taken over from John Law. His pleas were constant and clear: send us wives, but not the women you have sent before. In the past, the government had rounded up women from the streets, prostitutes and petty criminals, and deported them to the colony. These women, Bienville argued, did not build stable families. They brought their old troubles to a new world, creating more strife, more instability. Send us, he begged, good girls, pious, respectable, hard-working young women, women who can be the mothers of a new generation, women who can bring a civilizing influence to this wild place. And so the officials in Paris, looking at the financial drain of the colony on one hand and the overflowing expensive to maintain institutions like La Salpêtrière on the other, saw an elegant, if cynical, solution. They could solve two problems with a single stroke. They could relieve the state of the burden of caring for its female orphans, and they could populate and stabilize their troublesome Louisiana colony. The decision was made. A formal program was established. Young women of demonstrable good character who had been raised in the care of the church would be selected for emigration. They would be sent to Louisiana to marry the colonists. And because they had no families to provide for them, the king himself, Louis XV, would act as their father. They would be official wards of the crown, and the king would provide them with a dowry. This royal dowry was not a purse of gold or a deed to land. It was something far more practical, and in its own way, far more precious. It was a trousseau, a collection of clothing and necessities a bride would need to start her new life. And this entire trousseau was to be contained in a single, sturdy, portable container, a small wooden box, a chest, in French, a cassette. It was about 2 feet long, perhaps a foot wide and a foot deep, just large enough for a young woman to carry herself. It was made of a common wood like poplar or oak and bound with simple, strong iron straps. It had a handle on top and a small iron lock for which the girl would be given her own key. Imagine the day the caskets arrived at La Salpêtrière, a cart pulling up to the great stone gates loaded with identical wooden boxes. Imagine the quiet, ordered excitement that must have rippled through the gray dormitories. The nuns, their faces a carefully composed mask of stern duty, but with perhaps a flicker of pity or even vicarious excitement in their eyes, would have unrolled a scroll and begun to call out the names of the chosen: Marie-Anne, Geneviève, Marguerite, Jeanne, Elizabeth, Louise, Cécile. One by one, they would step forward from the ranks of their peers. They were so young, some barely 14, most in their late teens or early 20s. Their faces would be pale from a life lived almost entirely indoors. Their hands would be chapped and rough from constant labor. Their eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the workrooms, would be wide, filled with a dizzying cocktail of emotions: the terror of the unknown and the exhilarating, terrifying thrill of hope. Each girl would be presented with her key, a small, cold, heavy piece of iron. It was the first key many of them had ever held. The key to the box, the key to a new life, and then the moment of revelation. She would fit the key into the lock. The click of the mechanism turning would be a sound of profound significance. She would lift the lid. And the first thing that would have struck her is the smell. The clean, fresh scent of new linen and wool, the woody aroma of the box itself, perhaps a hint of wax or lavender used to keep it fresh. And then the colors. After a lifetime of gray, the sight of a petticoat dyed a deep crimson, or a ribbon of sky blue, must have been a shock to the senses. It was a treasure beyond her wildest imaginings. It was more than just clothing. It was a tangible symbol of her worth. It was proof that she was not a forgotten number in a state institution, but a person of value, a person recognized by the king himself. Let us linger for a moment on the contents of that box, on this litany of hope. Let us feel the textures and see the colors as she would have. First, the foundation of it all. 2 shifts of fine linen. Not the coarse, scratchy stuff of her convent habit, but smooth, soft, white linen. The kind of fabric that would feel gentle against the skin. A luxury she could not have dreamed of. Then the layers that build a respectable woman. 2 petticoats, one perhaps of a sturdy wool or serge for daily wear, the other for special occasions of shimmering taffeta, a fabric that would rustle when she walked, a sound of pure elegance. 6 headdresses, simple linen coifs or caps to keep her hair neatly covered as was the custom for modest women, but with them ribbons of silk, in colors like rose and periwinkle and spring green, a simple way to add a touch of personal flair, of beauty, to an otherwise sober costume. A jacket or bodice, likely of sturdy wool to be worn over her shift. It would be well made with tight seams and proper fastenings. Stockings, perhaps of wool for warmth, but maybe, if she was very lucky, a pair of silk stockings, so impossibly fine and delicate, a symbol of true gentility. And shoes, real shoes made of leather with a solid sole and perhaps even a small, shiny buckle. Not the worn-out wooden clogs or cloth slippers of the orphanage, shoes that would carry her into her new life. And then the tools of her new trade as a wife and homemaker, a sewing kit, a nécessaire. Inside, a thimble, sharp steel needles, pins, a pair of small, sharp scissors, and spools of good thread. The tools to mend, to create, to maintain a household. And finally for her soul, a missal, a prayer book bound in simple but sturdy leather, its pages filled with the Latin Mass and the prayers that had structured her entire existence. It was a connection to her past and a guide for her future. She would pack her few personal belongings, if she had any to speak of, a worn rosary given to her by a kind nun, a holy card with a picture of her patron saint, a single flower pressed between the pages of a book, a memory of the convent garden. Then she would close the lid of her casket. The sound of the latch clicking shut was the sound of a door closing on her old life. The key, now safely in her pocket or on a string around her neck, was the key to a future she could only imagine, a future built on the beautiful lies of the Mississippi Company pamphlets, a future in paradise. She was no longer an orphan of the Salpêtrière. She was a fille à la cassette, a casket girl, a ward of the king, a future bride of the Louisiana colony. She and her sisters in hope were ready for the journey. They could not have known, could not have possibly understood what that journey would demand of them, or what reality awaited them at its end. Their journey began not with the crashing waves of the ocean, but with the gentle current of the river Seine. They were gathered, a quiet, somber procession of young women, each one clutching the handle of her precious casket. They were loaded onto flat-bottomed river barges. As the barges were pulled away from the quay, they watched the familiar, grim walls of La Salpêtrière recede. They floated past the glorious spires of Notre Dame, past the grand, imposing facade of the Louvre Palace. They watched the city that had been their entire world, their prison and their only home, shrink into the misty distance until it was just a smudge on the horizon. Days later, they arrived at a port city on the coast of France, perhaps Lorient, the home port of the Company of the Indies, or Le Havre, and it was here that they saw the ocean for the first time. Let the gentle river sounds fade and be replaced by the vast open sound of the sea, the sharp cry of gulls circling overhead, the constant rhythmic hiss and roar of waves breaking on the shore, the snap of canvas in the wind, and a new smell, sharp and clean and wild, salt. Imagine that moment, standing on the stone quay, the wind whipping at your skirts and your linen coif, tasting the salt on your lips for the very first time, the sheer, terrifying, exhilarating immensity of it all, an endless expanse of gray-green water that stretched to the very edge of the world. And rising from the water, tethered to the dock by thick, hairy ropes, was the ship. the wooden mountain that would be their home, their transport, and their prison for the next 3 months. A ship like La Baleine, the Whale. It was the name of the vessel that carried one of the most famous contingents of Casket Girls, the group that arrived in New Orleans in 1728. The name was fitting. It was a great groaning wooden beast, and, like a whale, it was not designed for the comfort of human passengers. It was a cargo ship, a transport of the Company of the Indies. Its wide, deep hold was built to carry barrels of wine, bolts of cloth, and tools to the colony, and to return laden with tobacco, indigo, and timber. People were an afterthought. The girls were herded up the gangplank, their steps uncertain on the shifting wood. They would have clutched their caskets tightly, the one solid, familiar object in this bewildering new world. They were led down through a narrow hatchway, away from the light and the fresh sea air, into the 'tween decks, the space between the main deck and the cargo hold below. The bright light of the sun vanished, replaced by the swinging, shifting gloom of a few lanterns, casting long, dancing shadows. The air, which had been fresh with salt, immediately became thick, heavy, and stagnant. It was a potent cocktail of smells. The sharp, medicinal scent of tar used to seal the ship's timbers, the sour, stagnant odor of bilge water sloshing in the very bottom of the hull, the smell of the unwashed sailors, and soon enough the smell of their own closely packed, fearful bodies. They were crowded together in this semi-darkness. There were no cabins, no beds. They would have been assigned a space on the rough wooden floor to unroll a simple straw mattress, a palliasse. Their caskets were stacked around them, serving as benches, as tables, as small walls, creating a tiny illusion of privacy in the suffocatingly public space. Then came the motion. The ship would groan like a living creature in pain as the mooring ropes were cast off. It would shudder as the great sails caught the wind. The floor beneath their feet, the only solid ground they knew, began to tilt and sway, a constant, gentle, deeply unsettling motion that would not cease for months. For the first days, or even weeks, most of the girls would be racked with seasickness, a profound and total misery that emptied the body and the spirit, a feeling so wretched it felt like a rehearsal for death. They were not alone, of course. Their spiritual and moral welfare was entrusted to a handful of chaperones, Ursuline nuns, who had volunteered for this arduous mission. These nuns were women of formidable faith and grim practicality, accustomed to hardship. They established a routine, a fragile bubble of convent order in the chaos of the ship. They led the girls in daily prayers, the familiar Latin phrases a steady drone against the symphony of the ship's noises, the constant rhythmic creaking of 1,000 wooden joints, the roar of the wind in the rigging above, the crash and hiss of the waves against the hull. Day bled into indistinguishable day. Night was a deeper darkness, but otherwise the same. Their world shrank to the dim, rocking, smelly confines of the 'tween decks. To pass the endless hours, they would have talked. They would have shared stories of their lives in the orphanage. They would have sung hymns, their young voices rising in the gloom. And most of all, they would have talked about the future. They would have embellished the promises of the pamphlets, painting pictures for each other of the lives they were sailing toward. Husbands who were handsome and gentle and prosperous. Homes with whitewashed walls and real gardens filled with flowers. Plump, healthy children who would be born free in this new paradise. They would take out their sewing kits and work on a piece of embroidery or polish the wood of their caskets with a cloth, reaffirming the reality of the promise held within. They would clutch their iron keys as if they were holy relics. But the journey was long, and the reality of life at sea was brutal. The food was abysmal. The staple was salted beef or pork, so tough and briny it had to be soaked for hours to be even remotely chewable. And hardtack, a simple flour and water biscuit baked until it was as hard as a rock, a food designed to resist spoilage, but which often failed, becoming infested with weevils. The water stored in wooden barrels grew stale and slimy over the weeks, tasting of wood and algae. Under these conditions of poor nutrition and close quarters, sickness was a constant, looming threat. Scurvy from the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables would cause their gums to bleed and their joints to ache. Dysentery, a plague on sailing ships, could sweep through the crowded 'tween decks with terrifying speed. Fevers of unknown origin were common. Some of the girls did not survive the journey. One by one, they would succumb to illness, their small flame of hope extinguished in the damp darkness of the hold, their bodies, sewn into a canvas shroud and weighted down with a cannonball to ensure they sank, would be brought to the main deck. A brief, hurried prayer would be said by a nun or the ship's captain, and then with a heavy splash, the girl in her dreams would be committed to the vast, deep, indifferent ocean. Her ownerless casket, a small wooden coffin of hope, would be left behind, a heartbreaking reminder of the fragility of their venture. The other girls would watch, their faces pale, say a quiet prayer, and cling ever more tightly to their own caskets, to their own survival. And perhaps in the long, dark, feverish nights, rocked by the endless, hypnotic motion of the sea, strange thoughts and whispers began to form among the crew. The sailors, a notoriously superstitious lot, would have looked upon their human cargo with a certain amount of awe and fear. They would have seen these dozens of young women kept from the sun for months, their skin growing unnaturally pale. They would have seen them wasting away from malnutrition and sickness, becoming thin and ethereal. They would have seen them floating like specters through the gloom of the hold, always guarded by the stern, black-robed nuns. So many pale, quiet women, each with her own identical, mysterious box. These are just whispers, of course, the first faint, unformed seeds of a story, not yet planted in the fertile soil of New Orleans. In truth, they were just tired, frightened, and desperately hopeful young women enduring an ordeal that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. Then, after what must have felt like an eternity, something changed. The quality of the air, it grew heavier, thicker, more humid. The deep royal blue of the open ocean began to shift, lightening to a turquoise, and then becoming a murky, brownish green. And the clean, sharp smell of salt began to be mingled with a new scent, a rich, earthy smell, a smell of mud, of decay, and of living, breathing vegetation. It was the smell of land. It was the smell of the great Meschatebe, the Mississippi River, pouring its silt-laden freshwater miles out into the Gulf of Mexico. They had arrived, but this was not the paradise they had been promised. Let the sounds of the open ocean fade, and listen now to the sounds of the Louisiana coast. The buzzing of insects, a low, persistent hum that quickly grows into a high-pitched, whining cloud. The chirping of strange birds you've never heard before. The deep, guttural, resonant croak of a bullfrog, the soft, lapping sound of water against mud. The great ship, La Baleine, with its deep draft, could not sail directly up to the fledgling city. The mouth of the Mississippi River was, and still is, a treacherous, ever-shifting labyrinth of sandbars, mudflats, and hidden channels. The final leg of the journey, a 100-mile struggle upstream against the river's powerful current, had to be made in smaller, shallow draft boats. The girls in their precious caskets were transferred from the relative stability of the ship to pirogues, long, narrow canoes hollowed out from cypress logs, and to small, flat-bottomed barges. And now they saw Louisiana, the real Louisiana, and it must have broken their hearts. It was a wall, a solid, impenetrable wall of green, a dense, tangled, suffocating mass of cypress trees, their trunks flared at the base, their branches dripping with long gray beards of Spanish moss that swayed in the humid breeze like funeral shrouds. The water of the river was not blue or green, but the color of strong coffee, opaque and mysterious. Things moved beneath its surface, their presence hinted at by a ripple or a swirl. Great alligators, as long as a man is tall, sunned themselves on the muddy banks, looking like half-submerged logs until they opened a cold, ancient eye. Snakes, patterned in green and brown, slithered through the reeds at the water's edge. And the insects. The insects were a living torment, a constant, whining, biting cloud that descended upon them without mercy. Mosquitoes so thick they seemed like smoke, raising painful, itching welts on every inch of exposed, pale skin, biting flies, gnats, and a dozen other creatures they had no names for. These were not the gentle insects of a Parisian garden. This was a biblical plague. And the heat. It was not a gentle warmth. It was a physical presence, a heavy, wet, suffocating blanket that stole the breath from their lungs and drenched their woolen and taffeta clothes in sweat. This was a brutal, oppressive force. The promised land was a swamp. As their small boats were slowly poled and rowed up the winding river, past endless miles of this same monotonous, menacing landscape, the high hopes that had sustained them across the ocean must have begun to sink, settling like stones in their stomachs. Where were the grand houses? Where were the paved streets? Where were the gentlemen in their powdered wigs and silken coats? When they finally arrived at the clearing in the swamp that was called Nouvelle Orléans, this is what they saw. Let the sounds of the swamp blend now with the crude noises of a frontier settlement. The rhythmic clang of a single blacksmith's hammer, the steady chop-chop-chop of an axe biting into cypress wood, the rough shouts of men, and the constant squelching sound of boots pulling out of thick mud. New Orleans in 1728 was little more than an assertion against the wilderness. A grid of wide, muddy tracks had been laid out with ambitious, geometric precision by royal engineers, but the swamp was constantly trying to reclaim it. A few dozen crude houses stood on either side of these mud lanes. They were raised up on thick cypress posts to keep them out of the perpetual damp and the seasonal floods. Some were simple cabins of rough-sawn cypress planks. Many others were constructed in the method known as bousillage entre poteaux, a mixture of mud, Spanish moss, and animal hair packed between a timber frame. They were functional, but they were not the elegant homes of their dreams. There was a small wooden parish church which would one day become the great St. Louis Cathedral. There was a barracks for the soldiers, a company warehouse, and at the center of the grid, the Place d'Armes, the grand parade ground, which was most often a field of sucking mud, home to stray pigs and chickens. The air hung thick with the cloying smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and the raw, fecund scent of the surrounding swamp. This was their new home. The men of the colony, hearing of their arrival, gathered on the low earthen levee to watch the boats come in. And they were not the men from the pamphlets. They were soldiers in stained and faded uniforms. They were farmers, their skin burned dark by the sun, their hands calloused from their tools. They were the trappers and traders, the coureurs d'herbois, dressed in greasy deerskin, their faces hidden behind untrimmed beards, their eyes squinting from a life lived outdoors. They were hard men, living hard lives, and they looked upon this new shipment of women with a frank, raw, desperate hunger that must have terrified these girls who had been raised in the cloistered, sexless world of the convent. This was the moment of collision, the collision between a beautiful, manufactured dream and a brutal, muddy reality. But they were not entirely abandoned. The contract that had brought them here, the promise of the king, had one last bastion of civilization to uphold. Waiting for them on the levee, a small island of black and white order in the sea of masculine chaos, was a group of women. Women in the familiar habits of the Ursuline order. A single clear church bell begins to ring, cutting through the chaotic sounds of the settlement. The Ursuline nuns had arrived in New Orleans the year before in 1727 after their own arduous journey. Theirs was a mission of education and mercy. They came to establish the first school for girls in the territory, open to French, Native American, and enslaved children alike. They came to run the colony's crude hospital. They were women of immense faith, but also of incredible courage and pragmatic resolve. Their leader was the formidable Sister Marie Tranchepin, and among them was a young, observant, and literate nun named Sister Marie-Madeleine Hachard. It is through her letters home to her father in Rouen, France, that we have such a vivid first-hand account of this time. She wrote to her father of the alligators, which she called crocodiles, that were as thick as a man's body and 20 feet long. She wrote of the snakes, the oppressive humidity, and the immense challenges of trying to build a proper convent in the mud. And she wrote, with anticipation, of the imminent arrival of the Casket Girls. The Ursulines took charge immediately. They moved through the crowd of men, their authority unquestioned, and gathered the frightened, exhausted, sweat-soaked, and mosquito-bitten girls under their wing. They led them away from the leering eyes, through the squelching mud of the streets, to the temporary convent they had established. It was not a grand stone building like La Salpêtrière. It was a large, hastily constructed wooden house, the best and largest in the colony, likely the former residence of Governor Bienville himself. But inside there was order, there was quiet, there was prayer. For the Casket Girls, it must have felt like a miracle, a sanctuary from the terrifying, chaotic world outside its doors. Here they were given a place to sleep on a clean mattress. They were given a simple meal that was not hardtack or salty meat. They were given water to wash away the grime and sweat of their long river journey. Their precious caskets, the symbols of their entire venture, were brought in and stored securely. Here, in the care of the nuns, they would rest, they would recover, and they would wait. Their education began anew. But this was not the education of a Parisian convent. This was a practical crash course in how to be a Louisiana wife. The nuns who had already been there for a year taught them what they had learned about survival. They taught them how to cook with the strange new ingredients of this land, how to grind corn into meal, how to cook the local rice, how to prepare the unfamiliar fish from the river and the game, like deer and wild turkey from the forest. They taught them about the local herbs and plants that could be used for medicine, knowledge they were learning from the local Choctaw and other Native American women. And all the while they reinforced the girls' piety, reminding them that their ultimate duty was to God, to the king who had sponsored them, and to the future husbands who would soon claim them. And then the suitors began to arrive. The process was formal, highly structured, and profoundly awkward. The eligible bachelors of the colony, the soldiers, the farmers, the carpenters, the clerks for the Company of the Indies, would clean themselves up as best they could, putting on their least stained shirt, and present themselves at the convent door. A man would be admitted to a parlor where he would state his name, his occupation, and his prospects to the Mother Superior. The girls, dressed in their finest clothes from their caskets, their hair neatly coiffed, would then be brought into the room, either one by one or in small, chaperoned groups, under the fiercely watchful eyes of the nuns. There was no room for romance as we would know it. There was no courtship, no stolen glances, no slow blossoming of affection. It was, in its essence, a transaction, a match of mutual, desperate need. A man needed a wife to create a home, to cook his food, to mend his clothes, and to bear him children, to inherit his small plot of land. A girl needed a husband for protection, for sustenance, and for a legitimate place in this new, frightening society. A man would indicate his preference. A girl, presented with this stranger who would determine her entire future, would be asked for her consent. The historical record suggests the girls did have the right to refuse a match, and the nuns seem to have advocated for them. But the pressure to accept must have been immense. To refuse might mean waiting for months for another, perhaps worse, offer. Most, unless the man was utterly repulsive or cruel, would have quietly consented. The nuns would give their blessing, and a marriage would be arranged. Sister Marie-Madeleine Hachard wrote about these meetings. She saw the fear and the trepidation in the eyes of the girls, but she also saw their strength, their pragmatism. These were not helpless victims, they were survivors. They had survived the orphanage, they had survived the ocean. They would survive this too. One by one, they left the sanctuary of the convent. A marriage ceremony would be performed in the small wooden parish church. A young woman who had grown up a nameless orphan in Paris was now Madame Hebert, or Madame Leblanc, or Madame Trudeau. She walked with her new husband, a man she barely knew, through the muddy streets to a crude wooden house that was now her home. Her casket, her dowry from the king, was carried behind her. Her new life, her real life in Louisiana, had begun. A long pause. The sound of hammering and sawing returns, but it is now blended with new domestic sounds. The faint cry of a baby, the sizzle of food in a pan, the rhythmic sweeping of a broom on a wooden floor. Life was hard. It is difficult to overstate how hard it was. The paradise promised in the pamphlets was a cruel ghost that mocked them at every turn. The reality was a daily grinding struggle for the barest essentials of survival. The heat was a constant enemy. The suffocating humidity bred mildew on their precious clothes, warped the wood of their homes, and made every physical task an exhausting ordeal. And the diseases that thrived in the swampy environment, yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, were a constant, terrifying presence. They called the fever the fièvre au bois, the wood fever. It could strike with shocking speed, turning a healthy person into a corpse in a matter of days. A woman could go to bed a wife and wake up a widow. Children were especially vulnerable. The infant mortality rate was staggering. To raise a child to adulthood in early New Orleans was a triumph against overwhelming odds, a testament to a mother's fierce tenacity and a good deal of luck. And then there was the food. This became a famous, well-documented point of contention. The agricultural promises of the company had fallen flat. The staple food of the colony, the food that was available in abundance, was corn. Not the sweet corn we know, but a hard, starchy dent corn. It was ground into a coarse meal and boiled into a thick, gritty porridge. The French called it sagamité, a word borrowed from a Native American language. It was sagamité for breakfast, sagamité for dinner, sagamité for supper. For these women raised in France on the foundation of wheat bread, this was not just a monotonous diet. It was an insult. It was peasant food, animal food. Where were the promised gardens overflowing with bounty? Where were the wheat fields to bake proper bread? This frustration, this symbol of all the broken promises, finally boiled over in an event that has gone down in New Orleans history as the Petticoat Insurrection, or more viscerally, the Revolte des Marmites, the Revolt of the Pots. One day, a group of the colonial wives, many of them former Casket Girls, decided they had had enough. In a remarkable display of collective action, they left their homes, their cooking pots and pans in hand, and marched to the center of the settlement, to the muddy Place d'Armes. They gathered before the governor's residence and began to make a racket, banging their pots and pans together, a cacophony of metal on metal. They shouted, they complained, they demanded the food they had been promised. They had not crossed an ocean to be treated like this. They were respectable Frenchwomen, wives and mothers, not convicts to be fed on slave rations. They demanded bread. It was a small protest in a small, remote, muddy colony on the edge of the world, but it was profoundly significant. It was a declaration of identity. It was a refusal to suffer in silence. These were not the meek, obedient, downcast girls who had left La Salpêtrière. The hardships of this new world were forging them into something new, something tougher. They were becoming New Orleanians, a people known for their willingness to complain loudly and demand better. Governor Etienne Perrier, faced with a small army of angry, pot-banging women, had little choice but to take them seriously. He came out, he listened to their grievances, and he promised to do what he could to procure better flour and improve the rations for the colonists. He may or may not have been successful, but the women had made their point. They had found their collective voice. And it is here in this atmosphere of extreme hardship, of constant sickness and sudden death, of disappointment and disillusionment, it is here that the dark, Gothic legend of the Casket Girls begins to take root in the fertile, feverish imagination of the colony. Listen, the air grows a little cooler now. The story begins to change shape. It twists, like smoke from a dying fire. The facts remain, but they are seen through a different, darker lens. The colonists, the men who had married these women, the neighbors who lived beside them, looked at them. They were their wives, their friends, but they were also different. They remained so pale. Of course they did. In a world before sunscreen, any woman who valued her complexion, a sign of class and refinement, stayed out of the brutal, skin-darkening sun. They had also endured months of sunless travel and poor nutrition. They were often sick with the fevers of the region. But in the fearful, superstitious minds of the colonists, their persistent pallor seemed unnatural, a bloodless pallor. They were seen as secretive. Of course they were. They shared a profound, life-altering experience that no one else in the colony could possibly understand. The gray walls of the orphanage, the terrifying ocean crossing, the sanctuary of the Ursuline convent. They naturally formed a tight-knit community, a sisterhood of survivors. They would whisper to each other in the market, sharing news and advice in a shorthand of common experience. But to outsiders, to their husbands and neighbors, this looked like secrecy. What were they always whispering about? And then there was the sickness. Yellow fever, the saffron scourge, was a terrifying and gruesome way to die. One of its late-stage symptoms was something called black vomit, where the victim would bring up digested blood that looked like coffee grounds. In a pre-scientific age, a person dying, pale and wasted with a dark fluid oozing from their mouth, could easily be seen as the victim of something that had drained the life and the blood from them. And always at the center of the story, there were the caskets, their identical, mysterious caskets. Once the precious trousseau of clothes and linens had been taken out and put to use, what became of the empty wooden boxes? Most, in a poor colony where nothing was wasted, were likely repurposed. They became storage chests for grain or tools. Some were probably broken up for their wood, used to repair a fence or as fuel for a cooking fire, but some, the legend insists, were kept, stored away, put in the hot, dark attics of their small, crude houses. Or perhaps, as the story grew, they were returned for safekeeping to the one place that had sheltered them. They were returned to the Ursuline nuns, and the nuns by the 1740s were building a new home for themselves. In 1745, the cornerstone was laid for a grand, new, permanent convent, a building so sturdy, so well made, that it still stands today on Chartres Street in the French Quarter. It is the oldest building in the entire Mississippi Valley. It was a statement building, a fortress of faith and order in the heart of the chaotic, swampy city. It took years to complete, a slow and laborious process using the enslaved labor of African craftsmen and wood from old-growth cypress trees, a wood so dense and resistant to rot and insects it was nearly as hard as stone. The building rose 3 stories of solid, sober French colonial architecture. It had thick walls, a walled garden, and a steeply pitched roof, designed to shed the heavy Louisiana rains. A roof of that design creates a vast, dark, mysterious space beneath it, a large, shadowy attic. And the legend says, the story that has been whispered down through the generations, from mothers to daughters, from tour guides to tourists, is that the empty caskets of the filles à la cassette were moved from their individual homes and consolidated. They were taken to the new convent and stored all together in that vast, dark, third-floor attic. And the question began to be asked, whispered in taverns over cups of cheap rum, or in sick rooms by the flickering light of a candle. Why? Why would anyone keep a collection of empty wooden boxes? The legend begins to offer its own dark, terrifying explanation. Perhaps the boxes were never truly empty. Perhaps the girls had not brought a dowry of linens and lace from the old world. Perhaps they had brought a curse. The whispers took on a more sinister shape. You can almost hear them, can't you? The fearful gossip of a struggling community looking for a scapegoat. Did you see Madame Dubois at the market? So pale, she never seems to go out in the sun. Her husband died of the fever last week, but she seems untroubled by it, almost stronger. I heard a noise from their attic last night, a strange scratching sound like a rat, but bigger. They say the caskets they brought were not filled with clothes at all. They say the king sent them with a darker dowry. They say they were filled with the soil of their native land, so they would have a place to rest during the day. They say the nuns know the secret. That's why they keep the caskets locked away in the new convent, up on the 3rd floor, in the attic, to protect us. And there it is. The terrible, perfect Gothic alchemy of folklore. The Casket Girls become vampires. The transformation is complete. Take the historical fact of a group of pale, strange young women arriving from a distant land. Add the grim reality of early New Orleans. The constant presence of gruesome death from yellow fever, the oppressive heat that encourages nocturnal activity, the deep-seated superstitions of a colonial population. Add the central, mysterious, and powerfully symbolic object, the casket, a box that holds both treasure for a bride and a name that means coffin. And finally, place the objects of power in the perfect setting for a horror story, a forbidding 3-story convent run by mysterious women in black robes with a vast, sealed-off, inaccessible attic. The story from there writes itself, and like all good legends, it accrues more specific, chilling details over time. They say the storytellers of the French Quarter will tell you that the caskets in the Ursuline attic are not just stored there. They are nailed shut with heavy hand-forged nails that have been blessed by a priest to keep whatever is inside from getting out. They say that the shutters on the 3rd-floor windows of the convent, the windows of the attic, are sealed. And if you walk down Chartres Street today, you can look up and see it for yourself. The heavy wooden louvered shutters are indeed sealed shut. The official historical reason is practical. They were sealed in the 19th century to strengthen the building against the devastating force of hurricanes. But the legend offers a different, more chilling reason. They are sealed to prevent the creatures inside from escaping into the night. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is new and the air is thick and still, if you stand across the street and are very, very quiet, you can hear noises from that attic. Not the settling sounds of an old building, but something else. The faint, dry, unmistakable sound of scratching, fingernails on old wood, the sound of quiet, desperate weeping, and sometimes the sound of the caskets themselves, a faint rattling as if their ancient, skeletal occupants are stirring within, restless after centuries of confinement. They say that the nuns who still live and work in the convent today, the spiritual descendants of Sister Marie Tranchepin, know the secret, that they are the keepers of a terrible, centuries-old burden, a sacred duty passed down from one Mother Superior to the next. to guard the attic and keep its unholy secret safe from the world. They say that one night, many years ago in the 1970s, a team of paranormal investigators, or perhaps just a couple of brazen reporters, tried to stay the night in the building across the street, their cameras and microphones pointed at the sealed third-floor windows. As the night wore on, their equipment began to malfunction, and then one by one the heavy shutters were seen to burst open from the inside, thrown wide with a force that no wind could produce, revealing nothing but impenetrable blackness within. The terrified investigators fled, and the next day the shutters were found to be sealed as tightly as ever. It is a powerful story, a masterpiece of American Gothic horror, a story of blood and faith superimposed over the real and in many ways far more profound story of the Casket Girls. But what in the end is the truth? The truth is that these women were not monsters, they were mothers. They were survivors. They were the founding matriarchs of the city of New Orleans. Against all imaginable odds, they endured. They endured the swamp, the sickness, the heat, the hard-life husbands, the cornmeal mush, and the profound disappointment of broken promises. They did not just survive, they put down roots in the rich, muddy soil of this new world. They built homes, they managed households, they raised children, and their children raised children. Their French blood, their resilient spirit mingled over the decades with the blood of the German farmers who settled the coast upriver, with the Spanish who would come to rule the city for a time, with the free people of color who helped build its unique culture, with the Acadians who arrived after their own tragic exodus from Canada. The Casket Girls became the good stock of the emerging Creole aristocracy. For the great families of New Orleans, to be able to trace your lineage back to a filet à la cassette became the ultimate badge of honor. It was a genealogical seal of approval. It meant your family was not descended from the city's deported convicts or women of ill repute. It meant your family began with a respectable, pious, king-sponsored bride. Their story, the historical one, became a founding myth for the city's elite. The names of the girls who stepped off La Baleine in 1728 and the other ships that followed are woven into the very fabric of Louisiana's history. Their descendants became governors and mayors, artists and architects, musicians and writers. They built the city that we know today with its unique culture, its celebrated food, and its indomitable spirit. So the story of the Casket Girls has two legacies, two endings that run parallel to each other. One is a ghost story whispered in the dark, a story of pale vampires and sealed attics, a story that titillates and frightens, a story that adds another layer of dark romance to a city that thrives on it. It's a story the city tells about itself because New Orleans understands that its mystique is one of its most valuable commodities. The other is a story of history, a quiet, powerful story of human endurance, a story of young women plucked from poverty and anonymity and thrown into a world designed to break them, who not only refused to break, but prevailed. Women who took their small wooden caskets of hope and used them to build the foundations of a society. Which story is the truer one? Perhaps the question is flawed. Perhaps they are both true in their own ways. A city, after all, is more than just its documented facts and census records. A city is also its dreams, its fears, its memories, and its legends. The story of the vampire Casket Girls is a map of the colonial psyche. It tells us about the deep-seated fears of the early colonists, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the powerful forces of sickness and death that surrounded them, the fear and suspicion of these strange women who came from across the sea. The legend is a truth about how they felt. The historical story tells us a truth about what they did. It tells us about the incredible strength of the human spirit, and particularly the female spirit. It tells of the courage of a group of women who faced down a terrifying future and wrestled it into a home for themselves and for generations to come. So the next time you find yourself with the great fortune of walking through the French Quarter, perhaps late at night, when the raucous crowds on Bourbon Street have thinned and the air is still and heavy with the scent of jasmine and damp stone, look up at the old buildings, at the intricate ironwork of the balconies that drip with ferns, looking so much like the Spanish moss of the swamps. Listen, and listen past the sound of the saxophone. Listen past the rumble of the streetcar on the tracks. Listen for an older sound, the echo of their footsteps in the mud that once was the streets. Think of them. not as a monolith, but as individuals. Marie-Anne, Geneviève, Marguerite, Cécile. Think of their incredible journey from the gray, hopeless walls of a Parisian orphanage, across a vast and terrifying ocean, up a muddy, alligator-infested river, to this strange and menacing promised land. Think of their caskets, the small wooden boxes that held all their worldly possessions and all their earthly hopes, the boxes that gave them their name and from which their dark and beautiful legend was spawned. Think of them, not as vampires in an attic, not as shrieking ghosts, but as the brave and frightened and resilient young mothers of this strange and beautiful and haunted city. They are still here. They never left. But they are not locked away in the sealed attic of the old Ursuline convent. They are in the architecture that their children and grandchildren built. They are in the bloodlines of the city's oldest families. They are in the particular cadence of the local accent. They are in the rich, complex flavors of the Creole cuisine they helped to create. They are in the city's stubborn, flamboyant, and utterly unconquerable soul. The Casket Girls are all around you in New Orleans. And their story, the true story and the legend, a story of hardship, of hope, and of a myth that refuses to go to sleep, is a story that the city itself will continue to whisper to those who are willing to quiet their minds and listen for as long as the great river flows and the cypress trees stand sentinel in the swamp. Listen, the night is telling their story. Thank you for joining me on this long journey tonight. I hope it has brought you some peace and comfort. As you drift off now, may your dreams be sweet. If you enjoyed our time together, please do leave a comment when you can. I truly love to know that these stories are helping you unwind, and it's a special joy to read where in the world you're listening from. It makes our sleepy world feel a little smaller and warmer. Good night. Sleep well.